So here's the thing about being a millionaire in early America. It wasn't just rare, it was almost mythological. We're talking about a time when most people measured their wealth in acres of land, livestock, or maybe a decent pair of boots that didn't leak when it rained. $1 million? That was the kind of money that made you more powerful than some European royalty, and about as suspicious. In the 1700s and early 1800s, if you had $1 million, you weren't just rich, you were dangerous. You could buy politicians, build cities, crush competitors, and still have enough left over to commission a portrait of yourself looking stern and vaguely constipated, which was apparently the fashion. Society didn't quite know what to do with these people. Were they heroes of capitalism? Robber barons? Visionaries? Probably all three, depending on whether they were funding your town's new library or bankrupting your uncle's shipping company. This is the story of those first millionaires, the ones who built America's economy from scratch, made fortunes that would make your head spin, and lived lives so strange and complicated that you'll forget you're supposed to be falling asleep. Let's begin. John Jacob Astor, America's first true millionaire. Let me tell you about John Jacob Astor because his story is the kind of thing that would never happen today, and honestly, probably shouldn't have happened then either. But it did, and it made him the richest person in America. Astor arrived in New York around 1784 with 7 flutes and $25. Yes, flutes, not a metaphor. Actual musical instruments. He was a German immigrant who'd spent the boat ride over selling those flutes to passengers, which tells you everything you need to know about his sales skills. The man could probably have sold ice to a penguin. But Astor wasn't interested in a career in woodwind instruments. He wanted fur, specifically beaver fur, because in the late 18th century, European gentlemen were absolutely obsessed with beaver hats. And I do mean obsessed. These weren't just hats. They were status symbols, fashion statements, and apparently worth more than a small house. If you wanted to look important in 1790, you needed a beaver hat perched on your head like a furry crown of capitalism. So Astor, being Astor, decided to corner the market. He started small, buying pelts from Native American trappers and reselling them to European merchants. But small wasn't going to make him a millionaire, so he expanded. He created the American Fur Company in 1808, which sounds noble and patriotic until you realize it was essentially a monopoly designed to crush every other fur trader in North America. And it worked. Beautifully, ruthlessly, like a very polite steamroller. Now here's where it gets interesting. Astor wasn't just buying and selling fur, he was creating an empire. He established trading posts across the Great Lakes, the Pacific Northwest, all the way to what would become Oregon. He hired trappers, negotiated with indigenous tribes, and occasionally got into disputes that were, shall we say, less than friendly. There were accusations of unfair trading practices, of flooding markets to drive competitors into bankruptcy, of using political connections to get favorable legislation. None of this was illegal, mind you. But it also wasn't particularly kind. The fur trade made Astor rich. Very rich. By 1820, he was worth about $20 million, which in today's money would be somewhere around $500 million. But Astor knew something that most people didn't. Fur was a bubble, and bubbles pop. Beaver hats would eventually go out of style. Men's fashion would move on, as it always does, probably to something equally ridiculous. So Astor did what any smart capitalist would do. He diversified. And by diversified, I mean he bought half of Manhattan. This is not an exaggeration. Starting in the early 1800s, Astor began purchasing land in New York City. Not fancy land, not developed land. cheap land that nobody wanted because it was swampy, rocky, or located in neighborhoods that smelled like horse manure and rotting fish. But Astor had a vision. He knew the city would grow, that those swamps would be drained, those rocks cleared, and those neighborhoods gentrified into something resembling respectability. He was right. By the time Astor died in 1848, his real estate holdings were worth more than his entire fur empire ever was. He owned buildings, lots, entire blocks. He rented them out, watched the values climb, and basically invented the concept of being a New York City landlord, which is either his greatest achievement or his most questionable legacy, depending on your current rent situation. But let's talk about the man himself, because Astor was, by all accounts, kind of weird. He was notoriously frugal. Despite being the richest man in America, he dressed like a moderately successful accountant and lived in a house that was nice but not ostentatious. He didn't throw lavish parties. He didn't commission giant portraits of himself wrestling bears or whatever rich people did for fun back then. He just quietly accumulated more and more money, like a very polite dragon sitting on a pile of gold. His social life was equally strange. Astor had rivals, obviously. You don't build a monopoly without making enemies. But his feuds were conducted with a kind of icy politeness that was somehow more terrifying than actual anger. He would bankrupt competitors, drive them out of business, ruin their reputations, and then show up at the same social events acting like nothing had happened. Just smiling his thin little smile, sipping his wine, probably calculating property values in his head. The Astor family legacy continued long after John Jacob died. His children and grandchildren lived lives of spectacular wealth and occasional scandal. There were inheritance battles, because of course there were. When you leave behind a fortune that large, someone's going to argue about who gets the summer house in Newport. There were rumors of eccentric behavior, strange habits, and the kind of drama that only happens when you have more money than sense and too much time on your hands. But perhaps the most interesting thing about Astor's legacy is how it shaped New York City itself. The buildings he bought, the land he developed, the neighborhoods he invested in, they became the foundation of modern Manhattan. Walk through certain parts of the city today, and you're walking through John Jacob Astor's real estate portfolio, which is either impressive or slightly creepy, depending on your feelings about dead landlords. Astor died at age 84, surrounded by his fortune, and probably still calculating interest rates on his deathbed. He left behind an empire, a family dynasty, and a blueprint for how to make absurd amounts of money in America. Was he a visionary businessman? Absolutely. Was he also ruthless, calculating, and willing to crush anyone who got in his way? Also, yes. History is complicated like that. And speaking of complicated dynasties built on ruthless business practices, let's talk about a family that took everything Astor did and said, "Hold my champagne." The Vanderbilt dynasty, railroads, steamships, and ruthless competition. If John Jacob Astor was a polite dragon hoarding gold, Cornelius Vanderbilt was a pirate who somehow became respectable. And I don't mean that metaphorically. Early in his career, people literally called him Commodore, partly because he owned ships, and partly because he had the temperament of someone who might make you walk the plank if you underpaid for a ferry ticket. Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, which at the time was basically farmland with pretensions. His family wasn't poor, but they weren't rich either. They were the kind of people who worked hard, owned a little bit of land, and hoped their children would do slightly better than they did. Young Cornelius had other plans. Specifically, he had plans that involved boats, money, and dominating every waterway in America. At 16, he bought a small sailboat with money borrowed from his mother. This wasn't a pleasure craft. This was a working ferry, and Vanderbilt used it to transport passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. He charged less than his competitors, worked longer hours, and generally operated with the kind of manic energy that either leads to spectacular success or a nervous breakdown. In Vanderbilt's case, it led to success. By his mid 20s, he owned several boats and had a reputation for being reliable, fast, and completely unwilling to take nonsense from anyone. He expanded into steamships, which in the 1820s was like switching from horses to sports cars. Steamships were faster, more powerful, and way more expensive to operate. But Vanderbilt didn't care about expensive, he cared about winning, and win he did. By the 1830s, Vanderbilt was running steamship lines up and down the East Coast, undercutting competitors' prices until they either sold out to him or went bankrupt. His business strategy was essentially charge less, work harder, and outlast everyone else. It was effective. It was also exhausting to watch. Imagine playing Monopoly with someone who never gets tired, never makes mistakes, and somehow always has hotels on Boardwalk and Park Place. That was competing against Vanderbilt. But here's the thing about Vanderbilt that made him different from other robber barons of his era. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to humiliate his opponents. There are stories, verified, documented stories, of Vanderbilt deliberately running competing steamship companies into the ground just to prove a point. He would drop his prices so low that he was barely making money just to watch his rivals bleed cash. And then, once they were desperate and broken, he'd buy them out for pennies on the dollar. It was capitalism as blood sport. His most famous rivalry was with a steamship operator named Daniel Drew. These two men hated each other with the kind of passion usually reserved for fictional villains. They fought over routes, over contracts, over anything that could be fought over. Drew tried to outsmart Vanderbilt with financial tricks and stock manipulations. Vanderbilt responded by essentially declaring economic war. He built faster ships, charged lower prices, and drove Drew's companies to the brink of collapse. Eventually, they made peace, but it was the kind of peace where both sides are still glaring at each other across the treaty table. Now, while Vanderbilt was busy conquering America's waterways, something interesting was happening on land. Railroads were becoming a thing, and not just a thing, but the thing. The future of American transportation. Vanderbilt, who was now in his 60s and fabulously wealthy, looked at this new technology and thought, yes, I'll take all of that, please. So he did. Starting in the 1860s, Vanderbilt began buying up railroad companies with the same aggressive efficiency he'd used with steamships. He consolidated lines, improved infrastructure, and created what was essentially a railroad empire stretching from New York to Chicago. The New York Central Railroad became his crown jewel. And Vanderbilt ran it the same way he'd run everything else, with ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for incompetence. He was, by most accounts, a terrible boss. He demanded perfection, fired people constantly, and had no patience for excuses, but he also paid well, maintained his equipment, and actually cared about safety, which in the 1800s was almost revolutionary. Most railroad barons treated their workers like disposable parts and their passengers like cargo. Vanderbilt, for all his faults, at least wanted his trains to arrive on time without exploding. By the time he died in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt was worth about $100 million. In today's money, that's somewhere around $200 billion. With a B, he was richer than almost anyone on the planet, and he'd started with one borrowed boat. But let's talk about the family because this is where things get really interesting. Vanderbilt had 13 children, and he loved exactly one of them. Maybe. His favorite son, William Henry Vanderbilt, was the only one who inherited the bulk of the fortune. The other children got comparatively small amounts. and they were not happy about it. There were lawsuits, accusations of manipulation, family feuds that lasted for decades. One of his sons was essentially written out of the will for being too epileptic, which tells you everything you need to know about Vanderbilt's parenting philosophy. William Henry, the chosen heir, actually did a decent job managing the fortune. He doubled it within a few years, which is impressive when you consider how hard it is to double $100 million. But William's children, Cornelius's grandchildren, took the Vanderbilt fortune and transformed it into something entirely different. They became the embodiment of Gilded Age excess. We're talking about mansions that made European palaces look modest. The breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, which is still the largest privately owned house in America. These weren't homes. They were monuments to wealth, designed to make visitors feel small and poor and vaguely inadequate. The Vanderbilt grandchildren threw parties that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. They dressed in clothing that required teams of servants to put on. They collected art, married European nobility, and generally lived like characters from a novel that's just slightly too absurd to be believable. There were scandals, of course, divorces, which in the 1890s were social suicide, affairs, gambling debts, inheritance battles that made the previous generation's feuds look like polite disagreements. And here's the tragic part. Within 3 generations, most of the Vanderbilt fortune was gone. Not because of bad luck, but because it turns out that maintaining 15,000 square foot mansions and competing with other millionaires in a game of conspicuous consumption is really, really expensive. By the mid 1900s, most of the Vanderbilt descendants were living on trust funds and selling off family heirlooms. The empire that Cornelius built with one borrowed boat had basically evaporated. But the legacy remained. The buildings, the railroads, the steamship routes. They shaped American infrastructure in ways we still see today. Vanderbilt proved that in America, you could start with nothing and build an empire. You just had to be willing to work harder, think smarter, and crush anyone who got in your way. Whether that's inspiring or terrifying is up to you. And speaking of building empires through sheer determination and questionable ethics, let's talk about some other early millionaires who helped finance a revolution and then promptly had very complicated lives. The merchant princes, early shipping and trade, fortunes. Before the Astors and Vanderbilts, before the railroads and the real estate empires, there were the merchant princes. These were the men who built their fortunes on ships, trade routes, and the kind of financial wizardry that would make modern economists nervous. 2 of them stand out, Robert Morris and Stephen Girard. And their stories are perfect examples of how you can be brilliant, successful, and still end up in spectacular trouble. Let's start with Robert Morris, because his life reads like a cautionary tale written by someone who really wants you to understand the dangers of overconfidence. Morris was born in 1734 in England, came to America as a teenager, and quickly realized that the colonies were basically a giant business opportunity waiting to be exploited. He became a merchant, dealing in tobacco, flour, and pretty much anything else that could be shipped across the Atlantic. He was good at it. Very good. By the time the revolution started, Morris was one of the wealthiest men in Philadelphia, which in the 1770s was basically the economic heart of America. When the Continental Congress needed someone to finance the Revolutionary War, they turned to Morris. And Morris, God bless him, said yes. He used his own money, his credit, his business connections, everything he had to keep the Continental Army supplied and functional. He paid for weapons, food, uniforms. He negotiated loans from foreign governments. He basically became the ATM of the American Revolution, which sounds noble and patriotic because it was. But it was also financially insane. Morris was funding a war against the most powerful empire on earth. using money he didn't always have, making promises he couldn't always keep. It was the financial equivalent of juggling chainsaws while riding a unicycle. Impressive, but not sustainable. After the war, Morris was a hero. He'd helped win American independence. He'd proven that the colonies could organize themselves financially. Congress even offered him the position of Secretary of the Treasury, which he turned down because apparently he thought he'd done enough financial juggling for one lifetime. George Washington asked him to take the job again a few years later. Morris declined again. Looking back, these were probably the smartest decisions he ever made. Instead, Morris went back to business. But here's where things get weird. He started speculating in land. Huge tracts of land in Western territories that barely existed yet. Land that might be valuable someday or might just be expensive dirt. Morris bought millions of acres using money he borrowed, based on the assumption that land values would keep rising forever. They didn't. Land values crashed. Morris couldn't pay his debts. Creditors came calling. And in 1798, Robert Morris, the man who financed the American Revolution, was arrested for debt and thrown into debtor's prison. He spent 3.5 years locked up. 3.5 years sitting in a cell, probably thinking about all the decisions that led him there. The loans he shouldn't have taken. The land he shouldn't have bought. The fact that he'd gone from national hero to bankrupt prisoner in less than a decade. He was released in 1801 when Congress finally passed a bankruptcy law. He spent his remaining years living quietly on a small pension, provided by friends who remembered what he'd done for the country. He died in 1806, largely forgotten, which is a pretty depressing end for someone who literally helped create the United States. But if Robert Morris's story is a tragedy, Stephen Girard's story is, well, it's complicated. Girard was born in 1750 in France, went blind in one eye as a child, and decided that physical disability wasn't going to stop him from becoming obscenely wealthy. He moved to America in 1776, great timing, honestly, and started working as a merchant and ship captain. Girard was smart, ruthless, practical to the point of being almost robotic. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't waste money on anything that didn't generate more money. While other merchants were throwing parties and buying fancy clothes, Girard was reinvesting profits, expanding trade routes, and generally acting like a human compound interest calculator. He made his first fortune in shipping during the Napoleonic Wars, which is a polite way of saying he traded with both sides of a European conflict and made money from all of them. Was this unethical? Maybe. Was it illegal? Not technically. Was it the kind of thing that made people trust you? Absolutely not. But Girard didn't care about being liked. He cared about being rich. By the early 1800s, Girard had transitioned from shipping to banking. He bought the first bank of the United States building when the bank's charter expired, and turned it into his own private bank, the Bank of Stephen Girard, which is possibly the least creative name in banking history, but whatever. It worked. Girard's bank became one of the most important financial institutions in America. He loaned money to the government during the War of 1812, essentially doing what Robert Morris had done during the Revolution, except Girard was smart enough to demand collateral and charge interest. He wasn't going to end up in debtor's prison. No, sir. But here's the thing about Stephen Girard. He was deeply, profoundly unpleasant. He had almost no friends. His marriage was a disaster. His wife went insane and was institutionalized, and Girard basically pretended she didn't exist. He was notorious for being cold, calculating, and completely uninterested in social niceties. If you owed him money, he would collect. If you were late on a payment, he would ruin you. He operated with the warmth of a tax audit. Yet despite his personality, or maybe because of it, Girard was also strangely generous. When yellow fever epidemics hit Philadelphia, he personally went into hospitals to care for the sick, which is either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid depending on your risk tolerance. He donated huge amounts of money to charity, funded orphanages, and in his will, left most of his fortune to establish a school for poor orphans. Girard College, as it's now called, still exists. It's been educating underprivileged children since 1848, which means that Stephen Girard, cold, unpleasant, socially awkward Stephen Girard, has probably done more lasting good than most of the millionaires on this list. Life is funny that way. Both Morris and Girard were products of their time. They built fortunes in an era when America's economy was basically being invented in real time. There were no rules, no regulations, no safety nets. You either succeeded spectacularly or failed catastrophically, and sometimes you did both. Their personal scandals were quieter than the Vanderbilts, but no less interesting. Business disputes that turned into lifelong feuds, accusations of war profiteering, social friction caused by being either too generous or not generous enough. The early American financial world was small, and everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant that every deal, every loan, every bankruptcy was personal. And that brings us to an era when personal fortunes became so large, so incomprehensible, that they stopped being about individual merchants and started being about entire industries. The Gilded Age, new money millionaires. By the late 1800s, something strange was happening to American wealth. It was getting bigger. Not just buy a nice house and some land, bigger, but accidentally create a monopoly that controls an entire industry, bigger. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, and it brought with it a new breed of millionaire. These weren't merchants or traders or land speculators. These were men who built the empires out of steel and oil, who turned raw materials into incomprehensible fortunes, and who fundamentally changed what it meant to be rich in America. The two names everyone knows are Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and honestly, they deserve their reputations. Not because they were nice guys, they definitely weren't, but because they were so absurdly good at making money that it almost seems fictional. Their stories are about ambition, innovation, ruthlessness, and eventually guilt. Because when you make that much money that quickly, you start to wonder if maybe you should give some of it back, or all of it, or build some libraries and hope history forgives you. Let's start with Carnegie because his story has the benefit of being slightly less morally complicated than Rockefeller's. Slightly. Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in Scotland, in a town called Dunfermline, which sounds like something from a fantasy novel, but was actually just a depressed weaving community. His family was poor. Not occasionally worried about money poor, but literally worked in textile mills for pennies poor. When power looms came along and destroyed the hand weaving industry, the Carnegies did what a lot of desperate families did. They packed up and moved to America, betting everything on the promise that anyone could make it in the new world if they just worked hard enough. They settled in Pittsburgh, which in the mid-1800s was a grimy, smoky, industrial hellscape that smelled like coal and ambition. Young Andrew got a job in a textile mill making $1.20 per week, which is, not a lot, even in 1848 dollars. But Carnegie was the kind of kid who looked at poverty and decided it was temporary. He educated himself, taught himself bookkeeping, learned telegraphy, and basically did everything possible to make himself indispensable. It worked. By his early 20s, Carnegie had worked his way up to a position with the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he learned everything there was to know about big business, capital investment, and how to make rich men richer. He was good at it. So good that he started making investments on the side, bridges, railroads, oil wells. Everything he touched seemed to multiply in value, which is either incredible business sense or incredible luck. And with Carnegie, it was probably both. But Carnegie's real genius was recognizing that steel was going to be huge. Not just important, but civilization changing huge. Railroads needed steel rails, cities needed steel buildings. America's entire infrastructure was about to be rebuilt in steel, and Carnegie wanted to be the one selling it. So in 1873, he founded Carnegie Steel Company and proceeded to dominate the industry with the kind of efficiency that would make modern MBA students weep with joy. He used something called as vertical integration, which is a fancy way of saying he owned everything: the mines that produced the iron ore, the ships that transported it, the factories that turned it into steel, the railroads that shipped the finished product. He cut out middlemen, reduced costs, undercut competitors, and basically turned steel production into an assembly line before assembly lines were cool. Carnegie's mills ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers did 12-hour shifts in conditions that can only be described as absolutely terrible. The heat was unbearable, the work was dangerous, people died regularly from accidents, burns, and exhaustion. But steel production soared, prices dropped, and Carnegie became unimaginably wealthy. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was producing more steel than all of Great Britain. Not some of Britain's steel, all of it. Carnegie himself was worth somewhere around $400 million, which in today's money would be about $300 billion. With a B, he was richer than almost anyone in human history. But here's where Carnegie gets interesting. He didn't just hoard his wealth like some kind of Victorian dragon. He felt guilty about it. Really genuinely guilty. He'd grown up poor, remembered what poverty felt like, and couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he didn't actually deserve to have more money than entire countries. So he wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, which basically argued that rich people had a moral obligation to give their money away. Not to their children, Carnegie thought inherited wealth was bad for society, but to the public. Libraries, universities, hospitals, museums, anything that would help people improve themselves. And then he actually did it. After selling Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, Carnegie spent the rest of his life giving money away. He built 2,500 libraries, founded universities, established pension funds for teachers and workers. He gave away about 90% of his fortune, which is either incredibly noble or a really elaborate guilt trip, depending on how cynical you're feeling. Carnegie died in 1919, having transformed himself from robber baron to philanthropist. His legacy is complicated. On one hand, libraries, education, public good. On the other hand, the workers who died in his mills, the competitors he crushed, the ruthless business practices. History contains multitudes, and Carnegie contained more than most. But if Carnegie's story is about guilt and redemption, John D. Rockefeller's story is about efficiency taken to its terrifying, logical extreme. Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York to a father who was, by all accounts, kind of a con artist. William Rockefeller sold snake oil, literally sold fake medicine, and was periodically accused of various frauds and schemes. He also had a secret second family because apparently one family wasn't enough trouble. Young John D. learned early on that his father was unreliable and decided that he would be the exact opposite. Methodical, disciplined, and obsessively trustworthy. Rockefeller got into business young, working as a bookkeeper and saving every penny with the dedication of someone who'd seen what financial instability looked like. When the oil boom started in Pennsylvania in the 1860s, Rockefeller looked at the chaos. Hundreds of small companies drilling wells, refining oil, competing frantically. and saw opportunity. But he didn't want to drill for oil. That was unpredictable. Wells would dry up, prices would fluctuate, fortunes would rise and fall based on luck. Rockefeller wanted certainty, so instead, he built refineries. He processed other people's oil, turned it into kerosene, and sold it at a profit. It was slower, steadier, and infinitely more controllable. And then he started buying his competitors. Not aggressively like Vanderbilt, not through price wars or hostile takeovers. Rockefeller would just show up with a reasonable offer and explain very calmly that it would be better for everyone if his company, Standard Oil, absorbed their company. Better efficiency, better prices, better business. Most people sold. The ones who didn't found themselves mysteriously struggling as railroads raised their shipping rates or suppliers refused to work with them. Nothing illegal, you understand, just business. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of America's oil refining. 90%. That's not a company. That's a monopoly. Rockefeller had systematically acquired, merged, or destroyed almost every competitor in the industry. He'd created something that had never existed before, a true industrial empire. The thing about Rockefeller was that he wasn't motivated by luxury or status. He didn't build palaces or throw lavish parties. He lived modestly, went to church regularly, taught Sunday school, and gave 10% of his income to charity from the time he was a teenager. He was, by all accounts, a deeply religious man who genuinely believed that his wealth was a sign of God's favor and that he had a responsibility to use it wisely, which makes the monopoly thing even stranger. Because Rockefeller saw no contradiction between Christian charity and ruthlessly destroying competitors, in his mind, he was making the oil industry more efficient, bringing order to chaos, reducing waste. The fact that he was also becoming incomprehensibly wealthy was just a side effect, a natural consequence of good business. By the early 1900s, Rockefeller was worth about $900 million. In today's money, that's roughly $400 billion. He was almost certainly the richest person who had ever lived up to that point in history. And he kept giving money away to churches, universities, medical research. He funded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which helped develop treatments for yellow fever, meningitis, and hookworm. He established the University of Chicago, Spelman College, and countless other institutions. But the monopoly bothered people. It bothered them a lot. Journalists started writing exposés about Standard Oil's business practices. Ida Tarbell, a journalist whose father had been driven out of the oil business by Standard Oil, wrote a devastating series of articles detailing exactly how Rockefeller had built his empire. Secret deals with railroads, predatory pricing, intimidation. Nothing technically illegal, but definitely not what you'd call fair competition. The public was outraged. The government got involved. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil broken up into 34 separate companies. It was the biggest antitrust action in American history, designed to prevent any one person from controlling an entire industry ever again. The funny part? Breaking up Standard Oil made Rockefeller even richer. All those separate companies were still valuable, and Rockefeller owned stock in all of them. When they started competing against each other, their stock prices went up. Rockefeller's wealth increased. The man literally won by losing. He spent his later years playing golf, which he took up on doctor's orders, and approached with the same methodical efficiency he'd applied to oil refining. He hired professional instructors, kept detailed scorecards, and practiced constantly. Because of course he did. Even in retirement, Rockefeller couldn't do anything halfway. Rockefeller died in 1937 at age 97, having given away about $550 million during his lifetime. His children and grandchildren continued the philanthropic tradition, funding everything from modern art museums to environmental conservation. The Rockefeller name became synonymous with both massive wealth and massive charity, which is probably the best possible outcome for someone who spent half his life building a monopoly. Both Carnegie and Rockefeller represented a new kind of American wealth. The merchant princes had built fortunes through trade and finance. The Vanderbilts had used transportation, but Carnegie and Rockefeller built empires through industrial production, turning raw materials into products at scales that had never been possible before. They proved that in America, you could start with nothing and build something so large that it reshaped the entire economy. They also proved that making $1 billion is morally complicated. Both men were ruthless in business, crushed competitors, created monopolies, and operated in ways that would absolutely be illegal today. But they also gave away huge portions of their wealth, funded institutions that still exist, and genuinely seemed to believe they were improving society. Were they robber barons or philanthropists? Villains or visionaries? The answer, frustratingly, is yes. The Gilded Age was called Gilded for a reason. It looked shiny and beautiful on the surface: grand buildings, technological progress, spectacular fortunes. But underneath, there was poverty, exploitation, dangerous working conditions, and wealth inequality that would make modern economists nervous. Carnegie and Rockefeller sat at the top of that system, benefiting from it, perpetuating it, and eventually trying to fix it with libraries and universities and medical research. Their legacies are everywhere: the institutions they funded, the business practices they pioneered, the very concept that wealth comes with responsibility, that billionaires should give their money away rather than just passing it to their children. Love them or hate them, Carnegie and Rockefeller fundamentally changed what it meant to be rich in America. And while they were building their industrial empires in the East, something equally chaotic and fascinating was happening out West. Something involving gold, dust, sudden fortunes, and the kind of boom and bust economics that makes the stock market look stable by comparison. The gold rush and frontier millionaires. If the Gilded Age industrialists made their fortunes through careful planning and ruthless efficiency, the gold rush millionaires made theirs through sheer dumb luck and occasionally brilliant opportunism. Because in 1848, someone found gold in California, and suddenly everyone in America decided that moving to the other side of the continent to dig holes in the ground was a completely reasonable life plan. The California gold rush wasn't just an economic event. It was mass hysteria with prospecting tools. Within a year of the discovery at Sutter's Mill, something like 300,000 people had migrated to California. 300,000. These weren't experienced miners. These were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, criminals, dreamers, and desperate people who'd heard rumors about gold nuggets the size of your fist just lying around waiting to be picked up. Spoiler alert, there were not gold nuggets the size of your fist just lying around. Mining was brutal, dangerous, often unprofitable work. Most 49ers, as the gold seekers were called, went home broke, sick, or dead. The people who actually got rich during the gold rush weren't the miners. They were the people who sold stuff to miners. Enter Levi Strauss, who might be the most successful pants salesman in human history. Strauss was born in 1829 in Bavaria, immigrated to New York with his family, and spent his early years working in his brother's dry goods business. When the gold rush started, everyone in the family had the same thought. California needs supplies. Lots of supplies. Someone should probably sell them supplies. Levi volunteered. He packed up canvas, cloth, thread, scissors, basically everything you'd need to set up shop on the frontier, and sailed to San Francisco in 1853. And he immediately noticed something. Miners kept complaining about their pants. The pants available in California fell apart. They couldn't handle the physical demands of mining. crawling into tight spaces, kneeling in streams, climbing over rocks. Miners would go through multiple pairs of pants in a matter of weeks, which was both expensive and annoying. They needed something tougher, more durable, preferably something that wouldn't fall apart the first time you sneezed near a sharp rock. Strauss started experimenting with different fabrics. He tried canvas first, which was tough but uncomfortable. Then he imported a fabric from France called serge de Nîmes, which Americans bastardized into denim. He partnered with a tailor named Jacob Davis, who had the bright idea of reinforcing stress points with metal rivets. Together, they created pants that could survive frontier life. They called them waist overalls. We call them jeans. Strauss patented the design in 1873, and the business exploded. Not gold rush levels of explosive. This was slower, steadier growth, but incredibly successful. Miners loved them. Workers loved them. Eventually, everyone loved them. Levi Strauss and Co. became one of the most successful clothing companies in America, and it's still around today, which is more than you can say for most gold rush ventures. Strauss himself was, by all accounts, a decent guy. He paid his workers fairly, donated to charity, supported San Francisco's cultural institutions, and never acted like he was better than anyone else despite being a millionaire. When he died in 1902, the entire city of San Francisco basically shut down for his funeral. Schools closed, businesses closed. People genuinely mourned him, which is not something you can say about most Gilded Age millionaires. But Strauss's story is exceptional because he succeeded through actual innovation and decent business practices. Most gold rush millionaires succeeded through chaos, luck, and occasionally fraud. Take the mining tycoons. These were men who bought claims, organized mining operations, and extracted absolutely absurd amounts of gold and silver from the earth. The Comstock lode in Nevada, discovered in 1859, produced something like $400 million worth of silver over 20 years. The men who controlled those mines, George Hearst, James Fair, John Mackay, James Flood, became obscenely wealthy almost overnight. George Hearst is particularly interesting because he's proof that being good at finding valuable rocks doesn't necessarily make you good at anything else. Hearst had an almost supernatural ability to identify profitable mining claims. He bought land that other people thought was worthless, and it would turn out to contain massive deposits of gold or silver. He did this in California, Nevada, South Dakota, Montana. Everywhere he went, he somehow found valuable minerals. It was like having a superpower, except the superpower was geological intuition, and the result was millions of dollars. But Hearst was terrible at actually running things. He'd find the mine, start the operation, and then promptly lose interest or mismanage it until someone else had to step in. He got into politics, became a U.S. senator, and was by all accounts not particularly good at that either. He married a woman named Phoebe who was 20 years younger, and she turned out to be the smart one in the family. She managed their fortune, funded universities, supported the arts, and generally did all the things George should have been doing if he hadn't been obsessed with finding more rocks. Their son, William Randolph Hearst, took the family fortune and used it to build a media empire, but that's a different story for a different bedtime documentary. The thing about gold rush fortunes was their instability. Mines would boom and then bust. Claims that produced millions one year would be exhausted the next. Prices would fluctuate wildly based on supply, demand, and whether someone had just discovered a new deposit somewhere. Fortunes could be made in months and lost in weeks. There are dozens of stories about miners who struck it rich, spent everything on champagne and gambling, and ended up broke within a year. About businessmen who bought claims for thousands and sold them for millions. About con artists who sold shares in non-existent mines to gullible investors back east. The frontier economy was basically the Wild West version of cryptocurrency. Volatile, speculative, and full of people who were absolutely convinced they were about to get rich. Some did get rich, most didn't. But the gold rush fundamentally changed California and the American West. It created instant cities. San Francisco went from a tiny settlement to a major metropolis in a matter of years. It brought diverse populations together: Chinese immigrants, European migrants, African Americans, Mexican Californians, all trying to make their fortunes in the same dusty valleys. It led to massive infrastructure projects: railroads, telegraph lines, supply routes, because you can't have 300,000 people in the middle of nowhere without figuring out how to get them food and mail. It also led to some truly bizarre social dynamics. In mining camps where there were 100 men for every woman, social conventions got weird. Men would pay just to dance with women at parties. Laundry services charged absurd prices because nobody wanted to wash their own clothes. A single egg could cost $1 during shortages, which in 1849, money was genuinely expensive. The boom and bust nature of frontier capitalism created a culture of risk-taking that defined the American West for generations. People moved, invested, gambled, and hoped. Some made it, most didn't. But the promise, the possibility, was enough to keep people coming. And that promise wasn't limited to gold miners and pants salesmen. All across America, there were people quietly building fortunes in less flashy but equally important ways. The quiet millionaires who shaped cities. While Carnegie was making steel and Rockefeller was refining oil, and gold miners were punching holes in California, there was another class of millionaires building America's infrastructure. These weren't household names. They didn't make headlines or get their faces on magazine covers. They were the railroad barons who built towns, the real estate developers who planned cities, the canal builders who connected waterways, the industrial innovators who made factories possible. They were, in many ways, more important than the famous millionaires, because you can have all the steel and oil and gold in the world, but if you can't transport it, process it, or live near it, none of it matters. These quiet millionaires built the systems that made everything else possible. Let's talk about the railroad barons who weren't named Vanderbilt, because Cornelius got all the attention, but there were dozens of other men building rail lines across America, creating towns out of nothing, and fundamentally reshaping how people lived and worked. Take James J. Hill, who built the Great Northern Railway from Minnesota to Washington State. Hill was born in 1838 in Ontario, lost sight in his right eye in a childhood accident, and decided that physical disability wasn't going to stop him from building a transcontinental railroad. He started as a shipping clerk, worked his way up to managing steamboat lines, and then looked at the northern United States and thought, you know what this needs? Trains. The Great Northern was different from other transcontinental railroads because Hill actually planned it properly. Most railroad companies built as fast as possible, took government subsidies, cut corners, and ended up with shoddy infrastructure that barely worked. Hill built slowly, carefully, choosing efficient routes, constructing solid bridges, laying quality track. He didn't take government land grants, which meant he actually had to make the railroad profitable, rather than just taking free money and hoping for the best. It worked. The Great Northern became one of the few transcontinental railroads that didn't go bankrupt. And along the way, Hill created towns. Dozens of towns. He'd build a railroad station in the middle of nowhere, sell land cheaply to settlers, and suddenly there'd be a community. Churches, schools, businesses. He brought in Scandinavian immigrants, offered them farmland, gave them transportation to markets. He basically built the infrastructure of the Northern Plains states. Hill died in 1916 worth about $63 million, which is decent, but not Carnegie money. His legacy wasn't his wealth. It was the railroad, the towns, the communities that still exist because he decided trains should run through Montana. Then there were the real estate developers. Men like William Zeckendorf, Marshall Field, and Potter Palmer, who looked at cities and saw a possibility. They bought swampland and drained it, purchased blocks of deteriorating buildings and rebuilt them, created neighborhoods out of empty lots. Marshall Field is particularly interesting because he started as a store clerk and ended up owning one of the most successful department stores in America. Field was born in 1834 in Massachusetts, moved to Chicago in his early 20s, and got a job at a dry goods store. He was good at retail. Very good. He understood what customers wanted, how to display merchandise, how to make shopping an experience rather than just a transaction. By 1865, Field was a partner in the business. By 1881, he owned it outright. Marshall Field and Company became the model for modern department stores, elegant, organized, customer-focused. Field created the concept of the customer is always right, which has since been abused by generations of difficult shoppers, but in the 1880s was actually kind of revolutionary. Field also bought real estate, lots of real estate. He invested in Chicago's downtown, bought properties, developed them, and basically helped create the commercial district that still exists today. When he died in 1906, he was worth something like $120 million. His store continued for another 100 years before being absorbed by Macy's, which is honestly a pretty good run for a business. But it wasn't just railroads and retail. There were canal builders, men who saw rivers and thought, these need to be connected. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was financed and built by people who understood that connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean would transform trade in North America. And they were right. The canal turned New York City into America's dominant port, made Buffalo an important city, and created shipping routes that are still used today. The men who financed and built these canals, like DeWitt Clinton, who was New York's governor and the Erie Canal's biggest advocate, weren't motivated purely by profit. They genuinely believed infrastructure would improve society. And they were right, even if they also happened to get rich in the process. Industrial innovators followed a similar pattern. These were people who invented new manufacturing processes, developed better machinery, created products that made life easier. Men like Cyrus McCormick, who invented the mechanical reaper and transformed agriculture, or George Pullman, who designed luxury railroad sleeping cars and built an entire company town for his workers. Pullman's story is particularly complicated. He created genuinely innovative railroad cars, paid his workers decent wages, and built a planned community with housing, schools, and parks. But he also controlled every aspect of his workers' lives, where they lived, what they paid for rent, where they shopped. When there was an economic depression in 1893 and Pullman cut wages but not rent, his workers went on strike. The strike became violent, federal troops got involved, and Pullman's reputation never recovered. He died in 1897, and his funeral was held at night because the family was worried angry workers might vandalize his body. So even the quiet millionaires had drama. It just tended to be less flashy than the Vanderbilt's inheritance battles or Carnegie's labor conflicts. These men shaped American cities in ways we still see today. The neighborhoods they developed, the rail lines they built, the infrastructure they funded. They looked at empty land and saw potential. They invested in long-term projects that might not pay off for decades. They took risks, made fortunes, and occasionally created things that outlasted them. And they weren't alone. Because while male millionaires were getting all the attention, there were women building fortunes, managing estates, and quietly wielding enormous influence. Women whose stories have been largely forgotten but are absolutely worth remembering. Women of early American wealth. Here's something nobody tells you about early American millionaires. A surprising number of them were women. Not because society welcomed female entrepreneurs with open arms, it absolutely did not, but because wealth has a way of finding loopholes around social conventions. If you inherited enough money, or made enough money, or married and then outlived enough wealthy men, you could wield power that would otherwise be completely unavailable to women in the 17, 18, and 1900s. These women don't show up in most history books. They weren't building railroads or running for office or getting their names carved into university buildings, but they were managing massive estates, funding institutions, fighting legal battles, and occasionally being so eccentric that even other rich people thought they were weird. Their stories involve contested wills, strategic remarriages, inheritance battles that lasted decades, and the kind of quiet influence that shaped American society without making many headlines. Let's start with Hetty Green because her story is absolutely wild and also completely true. Hetty was born Henrietta Howland Robinson in 1834 to a Quaker family in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Her father was a wealthy whaling merchant, and Hetty grew up reading financial papers instead of romance novels, which tells you everything you need to know about her childhood. By age 13, she was managing her family's accounts. By her 20s, she understood finance better than most men twice her age. When her father died in 1865, Hetty inherited roughly $6 million. Her aunt also died around the same time and left money to charity, which Hetty contested. She claimed to have a newer will that left everything to her instead. The legal battle went on for years, involved accusations of forgery, and eventually Hetty lost. But the whole mess established her reputation as someone who would fight for every penny. Hetty married a wealthy businessman named Edward Green in 1867. The marriage contract specified that they would keep their finances completely separate, which was unusual for the time and also turned out to be very smart because Edward eventually lost all his money through bad investments. Hetty's fortune remained intact. She moved to New York and started investing. Bonds, mortgages, railroads, real estate. She bought properties during financial panics when prices were low and sold when markets recovered. She loaned money at interest rates that were legal but definitely not generous. She basically operated like a one-woman bank, except more ruthless and with worse fashion sense. Because here's the thing about Hetty Green. She was famously, spectacularly cheap. Despite being worth somewhere between $100 and $200 million by the time she died, Hetty wore the same black dress for years until it turned green with age. She lived in cheap boarding houses to avoid taxes. She ate cold oatmeal because she didn't want to pay for heat. There are stories, possibly exaggerated but widely reported, about her washing only the bottom of her dress to save on soap, or traveling to free clinics despite being able to afford the best doctors in America. Her son Ned broke his leg as a child, and Hetty allegedly tried to treat him at a free clinic. When doctors recognized her and asked for payment, she supposedly took him home to treat the injury herself. The leg never healed properly and eventually had to be amputated. Whether this story is completely accurate is debated by historians, but it was widely believed at the time, which tells you about Hetty's reputation. She died in 1916 worth about $100 million, having spent her entire adult life accumulating money and apparently deriving no joy from it whatsoever. Her children inherited the fortune and promptly spent it on all the things Hetty had refused to buy: mansions, art, luxury. Within a generation, the money was substantially diminished, which honestly feels like poetic justice. But Hetty Green, for all her weirdness, proved that women could succeed in finance if they were smart enough and stubborn enough. She just also proved that being good at making money doesn't necessarily make you good at being happy. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum was Sarah Breedlove, better known as Madam C.J. Walker, who became America's first female self-made millionaire through a combination of business genius and actually caring about other people. Walker was born in 1867 in Louisiana to parents who had been enslaved. She was orphaned by age 7, married at 14 to escape an abusive household, and widowed by 20. She worked as a washerwoman, making barely enough to survive, and developed a scalp condition that caused her hair to fall out. This was not just a cosmetic problem. For black women in the late 1800s, hair loss could affect employment, social status, everything. Walker started experimenting with home remedies and hair care products. She created a formula that worked for her, started selling it to other women, and discovered she had a talent for both product development and marketing. She moved to Denver, married a man named Charles Walker, and launched the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company in 1910. Her products were specifically designed for black women's hair, which was revolutionary because the cosmetics industry basically ignored black consumers. Walker created pomades, scalp treatments, and hair care systems. But more than that, she created a business model that employed thousands of black women as sales agents. She trained them, paid them well, and gave them economic independence at a time when opportunities for black women were almost non existent. Walker became wealthy, not Hetty Green wealthy, but genuinely rich. She built a mansion in Harlem, drove a custom car, wore fashionable clothes. She also donated huge amounts to charity, funded scholarships, supported anti lynching campaigns, and used her wealth to fight for civil rights. When she died in 1919, she left most of her fortune to educational institutions and charities that helped black communities. Her story is important not just because she made money, but because she made it on her own terms, helped other women in the process, and used her wealth to actually try to improve society, which, is a pretty good legacy. Then there were the society widows and heiresses who inherited wealth and managed it with varying degrees of competence. Women like Eliza Jumel, who was born into poverty in Providence, Rhode Island around 1775, worked as an actress and possibly a prostitute, and then married a wealthy French merchant named Stephen Jumel when she was in her 30s. Stephen died in 1832 under suspicious circumstances. He allegedly fell on a pitchfork, which is either a tragic accident or the worst disguised murder in history. Eliza inherited his fortune and became one of the wealthiest women in America. A year later, she married Aaron Burr, the former vice president who had killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. That marriage lasted about 6 months before Eliza filed for divorce, claiming Burr was mismanaging her money. The divorce was finalized the day Burr died, which is timing that seems almost deliberately ironic. Eliza lived until 1865, managing her fortune, fighting legal battles with her adopted daughter over inheritance, and generally being the kind of wealthy eccentric that Victorian society didn't quite know how to handle. She was powerful because she was rich, but she was also scandalous because of her past, and that combination made her simultaneously influential and socially suspect. Rebecca Lukens presents a different story, one of quiet competence rather than scandal. She inherited her father's iron mill in Pennsylvania in 1825 when her husband died suddenly. At the time, women didn't run industrial businesses. It just wasn't done. But Rebecca had grown up around the mill, understood the industry, and decided that social conventions were less important than keeping the business running. She managed Luke & Steel for 30 years, surviving financial panics, competing with larger companies, and maintaining profitability through sheer determination and business sense. The company still exists today. It's called Luke & Steel Company, which means Rebecca Lukens has one of the longest lasting business legacies of any 19th century entrepreneur, male or female. These women also shaped American institutions through charity and patronage. Wealthy widows funded hospitals, libraries, schools, orphanages. They had more freedom than married women to control their money, and many of them used that freedom to support causes they cared about. Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, an heiress who inherited a tobacco fortune, spent her life collecting art and supporting charitable organizations. When she died in 1887, she left her art collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and donated money to hospitals and churches. Her contributions helped establish the Met as a major cultural institution. Mary Mason Lyon founded Mount Holyoke College in 1837 with money she'd raised from wealthy women donors. The school provided higher education for women at a time when most colleges wouldn't admit them. It still exists today, having educated thousands of women who otherwise wouldn't have had access to university level learning. But not all stories of wealthy women were noble or charitable. There were absolutely scandals. Inheritance battles were common and often vicious. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died, his son William inherited most of the fortune, but William's wife, Alva Vanderbilt, later divorced him in 1895, which was social suicide at the time. She remarried and became Alva Belmont, threw parties that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and eventually became a suffragette. Using her wealth to fight for women's voting rights, her life was basically a soap opera, except real and with more mansions. There were contested wills constantly, adult children claiming their mothers were mentally incompetent, second wives fighting with stepchildren over estates, sisters disputing inheritances. The Gilded Age courts were full of these cases, and they were often uglier than any business dispute. The impact these women had on education, healthcare, and culture is hard to overstate. They funded women's colleges, children's hospitals, public libraries, art museums. They supported causes that male millionaires often ignored. And they did it despite legal restrictions that limited their rights, social conventions that questioned their competence, and family members who often tried to control their money. These women weren't saints. Some were ruthless. Some were eccentric to the point of dysfunction. Some married for money, spent fortunes on frivolous things, and contributed nothing beyond their own comfort. But many of them wielded their wealth intelligently, created institutions that outlasted them, and proved that women could manage money, run businesses, and shape society just as effectively as men. And speaking of how wealthy people shape society, let's talk about what their daily lives actually looked like. Because all this discussion of millions and monopolies and inheritance battles is fascinating, but what did these people actually do all day? How early millionaires lived? A cozy look at their lifestyles. Let's take a moment to imagine what it was like to actually be a millionaire in early America. Not the business deals or the public scandals, but the daily reality. What did you eat for breakfast? How did you spend your afternoons? What did your house look like? What were your hobbies, your routines, your oddly specific preferences? The answers are often weirder and more human than you'd expect. Start with the basics. Houses. If you were a merchant prince in the late 1700s or early 1800s, your house was probably nice but not absurd. 3 stories maybe. Good furniture, imported from Europe, decent paintings, a library if you were educated. Servants, obviously, because nobody with money did their own cooking or cleaning. But you weren't building palaces. You were living in an upgraded version of what normal wealthy people had. By the Gilded Age, though, all restraint vanished. Millionaires started building homes that can only be described as architectural fever dreams. The Vanderbilt family alone built multiple mansions that are now tourist attractions. The Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, has 70 rooms, marble imported from Italy, and a dining room that seated 30 people. It cost over $7 million to build in the 1890s, which in today's money is roughly $150 million for a summer house that they used for maybe 3 months a year. The Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, built by George Washington Vanderbilt, has 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. It sits on 8,000 acres. It has a bowling alley, an indoor pool, and a library with 23,000 books. It required an army of servants just to maintain. When it was built in the 1890s, it was the largest privately owned house in America. It still is. These houses weren't just places to live, they were statements, proof that you'd made it, that you belonged to the elite class, that you could spend more on curtains than most people earned in a lifetime. They were also, honestly, kind of impractical. Heating them was nearly impossible. Maintaining them required dozens of staff. Actually, living in them must have felt like residing in a museum where you happen to own all the exhibits. But let's talk about daily routines because that's where things get interesting. Wealthy men in the 1800s typically woke up late by modern standards, around 8 or 9 in the morning. They'd have breakfast, which was often a serious affair, not a quick bowl of cereal. We're talking multiple courses, eggs, bacon, toast, fruit, sometimes fish or steak, coffee or tea, the morning paper. Breakfast could easily take an hour. After breakfast, they'd handle correspondence. Letters were how business got done before telephones became common. A wealthy businessman might spend hours every day writing letters, dictating to secretaries, reviewing contracts. This was work, but it was done from a comfortable study with good lighting and expensive furniture. Lunch was another multi-course meal, often taken at a private club. Gentlemen's clubs were huge in the Gilded Age. These were exclusive organizations, usually for wealthy white men only, where members could eat, socialize, conduct business, and generally exist without having to interact with people they considered beneath them. The Union Club, the Metropolitan Club, the Century Association, each had different membership criteria and social cachet. Being accepted into the right clubs mattered almost as much as making money. Afternoons might involve business meetings, but they also involved leisure. Wealthy men played golf, went horseback riding, attended the races, sailed yachts. These weren't just hobbies, they were social activities where deals were made, alliances formed, and status established. Cornelius Vanderbilt loved horses and owned a stable of thoroughbreds. J.P. Morgan collected art and yachts. John D. Rockefeller played golf obsessively, treating it with the same seriousness he'd applied to building Standard Oil. Evenings were for dining and entertaining. Dinner parties were elaborate social events that could last 4 or 5 hours. Multiple courses, appetizers, soup, fish, meat, salad, dessert, cheese, different wines with each course. Conversation that was expected to be witty but not too controversial. The dining room at a Gilded Age mansion might seat 20 or 30 people, and hosting a successful dinner party required planning that rivaled military operations. Women's routines were different but equally structured. Wealthy women in the 1800s and early 1900s didn't work, at least not in any recognized sense. But they had responsibilities. Managing a large household was basically a full-time job. You had to supervise servants, plan menus, oversee children's education, organize social events, and maintain the family's social standing through carefully calculated visiting schedules and charity work. The calling card system alone was absurdly complex. Women would visit each other's homes, leave cards with specific corners folded to indicate different messages, follow elaborate rules about who could visit whom and when. It was social networking, except instead of Facebook, you had to actually put on a corset and ride a carriage across town to leave a small piece of paper in someone's foyer. Fashion was equally complicated and expensive. Wealthy women changed clothes multiple times per day. Morning dress, afternoon dress, dinner dress, ball gown. Each outfit required different accessories, different jewelry, different hairstyles. Getting dressed could take an hour with the help of a lady's maid. Corsets had to be laced, dozens of buttons fastened, hair arranged into elaborate styles that required pins, combs, and occasionally small wire frames. But beyond the routines, there were the quirks. The eccentric habits that made each millionaire unique. Hetty Green, as we mentioned, wore the same dress until it disintegrated. But she also kept her money in a safe deposit box and would show up at her bank regularly to clip bond coupons personally, despite being one of the richest people in America. She didn't trust anyone else to handle her finances. Andrew Carnegie had a thing about height. He was short, around 5'3", and supposedly had the legs of his furniture shortened so that when guests sat down, they'd be at eye level with him. Power moves before power moves were a thing. J.P. Morgan had a condition called rhinophyma that made his nose bulbous and discolored. He was deeply self-conscious about it, hated being photographed, and would sometimes refuse to meet people because of how he looked. Despite being one of the most powerful financiers in the world, he was insecure about his appearance. John D. Rockefeller gave dimes to children and strangers as a kind of personal branding exercise. He'd hand them out randomly, explaining that saving and investing small amounts would lead to wealth. Whether this was genuine financial advice or just weird PR is unclear, but people remembered it. Wealthy families also had holiday traditions that ranged from wholesome to absurd. Christmas celebrations could be spectacular. Giant trees, elaborate decorations, expensive gifts. But they were also performances. Showing off your Christmas display was a way of proving your wealth and taste. Some families would open their homes to the public for viewing, turning their holiday decorations into tourist attractions. Summer vacations meant Newport or the Hamptons or European tours. Wealthy families would pack up entire households, servants, trunks full of clothes, sometimes even furniture, and relocate for months at a time. The logistics were insane, but nobody questioned it because that's just what rich people did. Social clubs and fraternal organizations were important. Men joined everything from Masonic lodges to yacht clubs to business associations. These organizations provided networking, social status, and entertainment. They also reinforced class boundaries because membership was carefully controlled and poor people simply weren't welcome. Travel habits were different too. Wealthy Americans in the Gilded Age took grand tours of Europe, visiting museums, attending operas, buying art. They'd stay in the finest hotels, hire private guides, and generally behave like modern trust fund kids on Instagram, except with more formal clothing and no social media. Food was both lavish and weird by modern standards. Rich people ate things that would make contemporary dietitians weep. Multi-course meals heavy on meat, butter, and cream. Desserts that required scaffolding. Turtle soup was considered a delicacy. So were oysters, which people ate by the dozens. Vegetables were often overcooked into mush. Salads were rare. The concept of eating healthy didn't really exist. You ate to show that you could afford good food, not to optimize nutrition. And then there were the pets. Wealthy people had dogs, horses, exotic birds, sometimes more unusual animals. Caroline Astor, matriarch of the Astor family and queen of New York society, was famous for her elaborate balls and strict social hierarchy. She also kept a pet monkey for a while because apparently being the most powerful woman in New York society wasn't interesting enough without a primate. The extravagance extended to funerals. When wealthy people died, their funerals were events. Elaborate caskets, huge processions, monuments that cost more than most houses. Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn and similar burial grounds became showcases for wealthy families' monuments, mausoleums, statues, elaborate grave markers. Death was just another opportunity to display status. But underneath all the mansions and dinner parties and social climbing, these were still humans with human problems. They got sick, felt lonely, worried about their children, dealt with difficult relatives. They just did it while wearing expensive clothes in oversized houses, and sometimes those human problems escalated into full-blown public scandals that made everyone forget about the dinner parties and remember the drama. Rivalries, feuds, and public scandals. If you thought making millions of dollars was the interesting part of these people's lives, you were wrong. The interesting part was what happened when millionaires decided they hated each other and had the resources to make that hatred everyone else's problem. Early American wealth came with drama. Lots of drama. Business rivals who fought like cartoon villains. Family feuds that lasted generations. Legal battles that consumed years and fortunes. Public scandals involving everything from contested wills to mysterious deaths to divorces that shocked polite society. These weren't quiet disagreements settled over tea. These were wars conducted with lawyers, newspapers, and occasionally actual violence. Let's start with the business rivalries because they were spectacular. Cornelius Vanderbilt versus everyone is a good place to begin. The Commodore didn't just compete with other businessmen, he crushed them. His rivalry with Daniel Drew, whom we mentioned earlier, was legendary. Drew was a steamboat and railroad operator who used every financial trick imaginable to compete with Vanderbilt. Stock manipulation, bribes, spreading false rumors. If it was legally questionable, but technically not criminal, Drew tried it. Vanderbilt responded by doing exactly what he always did, outworking and outlasting his opponent. He dropped prices, improved service, bought out Drew's allies, and generally made doing business so difficult for Drew that the man eventually gave up. But the rivalry never really ended. They just moved it from steamboats to railroads, where they continued fighting over routes and contracts for years. Then there was Vanderbilt versus the Erie Railroad, which is possibly the most absurd business battle in American history. In the 1860s, Vanderbilt wanted to buy the Erie Railroad to expand his empire. But three men controlled it: Daniel Drew, Jim Fisk, and Jay Gould. These three looked at Vanderbilt's attempted takeover and thought, let's commit some light financial fraud. They started printing counterfeit stock certificates. Not fake in the sense of being illegal. They had technical authority to issue new shares, but fake in the sense of being deliberately designed to dilute Vanderbilt's holdings. Every time Vanderbilt bought Erie stock, trying to gain control, Drew and his partners would print more shares and sell them. Vanderbilt kept buying. They kept printing. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom, except the bucket cost millions of dollars. Eventually, Drew, Fisk, and Gould fled to New Jersey with $6 million in cash to avoid arrest. They literally crossed the Hudson River with bags of money and holed up in a hotel while their lawyers fought Vanderbilt's lawyers in court. The whole thing ended with a settlement where Vanderbilt basically gave up, and everyone went back to making money elsewhere. But the sheer chaos of the Erie War became legendary. Fisk himself deserves a mention because his life was like a soap opera written by someone on hallucinogens. He was a flamboyant businessman who dressed in military uniforms despite never serving in the military, threw lavish parties, and had a very public affair with an actress named Josie Mansfield. When Mansfield left him for another man, Fisk threatened the new boyfriend. The boyfriend shot Fisk to death in 1872 on the staircase of a New York hotel. Fisk died at 36, having lived more dramatically in 3 decades than most people do in 3 lifetimes. Railroad barons in general seemed to love fighting each other. James J. Hill of the Great Northern Railway feuded with Edward Harriman of the Union Pacific over control of the Northern Pacific Railway. They fought with stock purchases, legal battles, and political influence. At one point, their competition nearly crashed the stock market. They eventually formed an alliance because destroying each other was getting expensive, but the rivalry defined late 19th century railroad politics. Then there were the industrial rivalries. Andrew Carnegie and Henry Frick were business partners who ended up hating each other so much that they literally stopped speaking. Frick was Carnegie Steel's chairman, a brutal manager who crushed the Homestead Strike of 1892 with private security and violence. Carnegie, who was conveniently in Scotland during the strike, later blamed Frick publicly. Their relationship deteriorated. They fought over business decisions. Eventually, Carnegie forced Frick out of the company. The two men spent the rest of their lives feuding. When Carnegie tried to reconcile years later, Frick reportedly said, "Tell Mr. Carnegie I'll see him in hell, where we are both going," which is honestly one of the greatest rejection lines in history. They never spoke again. Both died in 1919, Carnegie in August, Frick in December, having wasted decades nursing a grudge. Inheritance disputes were even messier. Wealthy families fought over wills with the intensity of medieval succession wars. The Vanderbilt inheritance battles were legendary. When Cornelius died in 1877, he left 95% of his fortune to one son, William. The other children got comparatively little and were furious. They contested the will, claiming Cornelius had been mentally incompetent. The trial lasted months, involved humiliating testimony about Cornelius's personal life, and ultimately failed. But the family never really recovered. Resentments lasted for generations. William's children also fought over money. When William died in 1885, his will tried to divide the fortune more evenly, but that just led to different arguments. Who got which mansion? Who controlled which trusts? The legal battles and family drama consumed years. Public scandals of a more personal nature were equally fascinating. Divorces were rare in the 1800s and early 1900s, partly because they were legally difficult and partly because they destroyed your social standing. When wealthy people divorced, it was major news. Alva Vanderbilt's divorce from William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1895 shocked society. Wealthy people simply didn't divorce, especially not women who initiated it. But Alva wanted out, so she manufactured a scandal by allegedly arranging for her husband to be caught with another woman, which gave her grounds for divorce under New York law. She got her divorce, remarried, and eventually became a suffragette, which confused everyone who thought she was just a society lady. There were also inheritance scandals involving women. When George Pullman died, his wife fought with business partners over control of the Pullman Company. When Russell Sage, a wealthy financier, died without leaving much to his wife despite being worth $70 million, she publicly criticized him and then spent the rest of her life giving away money to spite his memory. She founded Russell Sage College, funded libraries and hospitals, and basically became the opposite of her miserly late husband. Political influence was another source of scandal. Wealthy businessmen regularly bought politicians, which wasn't even illegal until the early 1900s. They'd fund campaigns, offer loans that never got repaid, provide cushy jobs to legislators' relatives. In return, they'd get favorable legislation, government contracts, relaxed regulations. William Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall wasn't technically a millionaire when he started, but he became one through corruption. He controlled New York City politics in the 1860s and early 1870s, skimming money from public contracts and kickbacks. When he was finally caught and prosecuted, the scandal exposed how deeply corruption ran in city government. Tweed died in prison in 1878, which is what happens when you steal from millionaires who have better lawyers than you do. Newspaper wars were particularly vicious. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer fought for readers in New York in the 1890s by publishing increasingly sensational stories. They'd print rumors, scandals, accusations, anything to sell papers. Their competition helped start the Spanish-American War by publishing inflammatory stories about Spanish atrocities in Cuba, most of which were exaggerated or false. Yellow journalism became a term for this kind of sensational, truth-optional reporting, and it was profitable enough that both men became even wealthier despite the ethical problems. Sometimes the feuds got personal and petty. Carnegie and Rockefeller competed over who could give away more money. It was philanthropy as a competitive sport, which is honestly kind of great. Oh, you built a library? Well, I built 20 libraries and a research institute. They were trying to outdonate each other, which is possibly the best kind of rivalry rich people can have. Business sabotage was common, but usually subtle. Competitors would spread rumors about each other's financial stability, trying to cause bank runs. They'd bribe each other's employees to leak information. They'd form temporary alliances to crush a mutual competitor, then immediately turn on each other. The public ate this up. Newspapers covered wealthy people's feuds like sports matches. Society columns tracked who was feuding with whom, who'd cut whom at a party, whose invitation had been declined. It was entertainment for people who couldn't afford to attend these events themselves. And honestly, these scandals humanized the millionaires. It's hard to think of someone as a distant economic force when you know they're arguing with their siblings over who gets grandmother's china, or that they're so petty they built a bigger mansion than their rival just to prove a point. But for all the drama and scandal and public feuding, these fortunes weren't eternal. In fact, many of them disappeared faster than anyone expected. The downfalls, how many early millionaires lost everything. Here's the uncomfortable truth about early American fortunes. Most of them didn't last. We remember the Rockefellers and the Carnegies because their wealth survived multiple generations. But for every fortune that endured, there were dozens that vanished within a lifetime, sometimes spectacularly, sometimes quietly, but almost always completely. The reasons varied: market crashes, bad investments, technological shifts that made entire industries obsolete overnight, family mismanagement, expensive divorces, gambling habits. Sometimes it was one catastrophic decision. Sometimes it was 1,000 small mistakes compounding over years, but the result was the same: millionaires becoming regular people again, except with the added humiliation of having once been rich. Robert Morris, whom we discussed earlier, is the classic example. The man financed the American Revolution and ended up in debtor's prison because he couldn't stop speculating on land. He borrowed millions to buy territory that he was absolutely certain would increase in value. When land prices crashed instead, Morris couldn't pay his debts. Creditors sued. Courts ruled against him. And in 1798, Robert Morris, former superintendent of finance, friend of George Washington, literal financier of American independence, was arrested and locked up. He spent over 3 years imprisoned for debt, watching from his cell as the country he'd helped create moved on without him. When Congress finally passed bankruptcy legislation in 1801, Morris was released, but he was broken. Financially, socially, psychologically. He lived his remaining years on a small pension, largely forgotten. It's hard to imagine a more complete reversal of fortune. But Morris wasn't alone. Nicholas Biddle ran the second bank of the United States, was one of the most powerful financiers in America, and ended up bankrupt after political battles with Andrew Jackson destroyed his bank. He spent his final years fighting lawsuits and watching his reputation crumble. Then there were the fortunes lost to technological change. Whaling made people rich in the early 1800s. New Bedford, Massachusetts was full of millionaires who'd made their money from whale oil, which was used for lamps, lubrication, and dozens of other products. Then petroleum was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859. Suddenly, whale oil was obsolete. Too expensive, too dangerous to obtain, completely unnecessary when you could just drill for oil instead. The whaling fortunes evaporated within a generation. Ships that had been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars became worthless. Families that had lived in mansions sold them and moved to smaller homes. Some adapted, invested in other industries, moved into different businesses. but many didn't. They just watched their wealth disappear as the world moved on. The same thing happened with canals. The Erie Canal made people spectacularly wealthy in the 1820s and 30s. Then railroads came along and made canals mostly irrelevant. Canal investors lost everything. The infrastructure they'd built was still there. You can't exactly move a canal, but it was worth a fraction of what it had been. Market crashes were particularly brutal. The Panic of 1837 destroyed fortunes across America. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. Real estate values plummeted. People who'd been wealthy on paper discovered that paper wealth evaporates quickly when banks close and nobody's buying. The depression that followed lasted 7 years, which was long enough for most affected fortunes to be permanently destroyed. The Panic of 1857 did similar damage. So did the Panic of 1873, which was triggered partly by railroad overexpansion and partly by international financial instability. Millionaires who'd invested heavily in railroads or real estate watched their holdings become worthless. Some committed suicide, others fled the country to avoid creditors. The lucky ones just went broke and had to start over. Family mismanagement was another common cause of fortune loss. Andrew Carnegie famously didn't believe in inherited wealth, and he had good reason. He'd watched too many wealthy families destroy themselves through incompetent heirs who didn't understand business, didn't appreciate money, and assumed wealth was permanent. The Vanderbilt fortune is instructive here. Cornelius left $100 million. His son William doubled it to $200 million. William's children spent it on mansions, parties, art collections, and generally living like minor royalty. Their children spent even more extravagantly. By the mid-1900s, most of the Vanderbilt descendants were living on trust funds and inheritances that were shadows of the original fortune. When 120 Vanderbilt descendants held a family reunion in 1973, not one of them was wealthy enough to maintain the family mansions. The Breakers, that 70-room summer house in Newport, had been donated to a preservation society because the family couldn't afford to keep it. The fortune that had seemed permanent in 1877 was basically gone within 3 generations. Some fortunes were lost to simple bad luck and timing. Jay Cooke was one of the most successful bankers in America, helped finance the Civil War, and seemed financially invincible. Then he invested heavily in the Northern Pacific Railway, promoting it aggressively and selling bonds to fund construction. When the railroad struggled and couldn't pay its debts, Cooke's banking firm collapsed in 1873, triggering a financial panic that destroyed his fortune and reputation. Divorces, though rare, could be financially devastating. When wealthy couples split, the legal battles often consumed enormous amounts of money. Lawyers got rich. The couple ended up with fractions of what they'd had before. William Zeckendorf, a major real estate developer, lost much of his fortune in the 1960s, partly due to expensive divorces and lifestyle costs that exceeded even his substantial income. Gambling was another destroyer of fortunes, though it was usually kept quiet. Wealthy men would bet on horses, cards, business ventures that were essentially gambling. Some controlled it, others couldn't stop. There are stories of millionaires losing hundreds of thousands in single nights at private clubs, then trying to recoup losses through increasingly risky investments that only made things worse. Personal scandals could destroy wealth too. If you were caught in serious fraud, embezzlement, or other crimes, not only would you face prosecution, but your business relationships would evaporate. Partners would flee. Investors would demand their money back. Your social network, which for wealthy people was often how deals got done, would abandon you. Financial ruin would follow social ruin almost automatically. The transition from old industries to new ones claimed fortunes regularly. Coal millionaires watched their wealth diminish as oil became dominant. Railroad fortunes declined when automobiles and trucks became common. Textile manufacturers lost money when production moved overseas or automation reduced labor needs. If you couldn't adapt your business to changing times, your wealth wouldn't survive. But perhaps the saddest fortunes were those lost simply to poor planning. Wealthy people who didn't diversify investments, who kept all their money in one industry, one company, one type of asset. When that single thing failed, and eventually everything fails, they lost everything. It was the financial equivalent of putting all your eggs in one very expensive basket and then dropping the basket off a cliff. The lesson, if there is one, is that wealth is fragile. It requires constant attention, intelligent management, adaptation to changing circumstances, and a bit of luck. The millionaires who lost everything weren't necessarily stupid or careless. They just made mistakes or got unlucky or couldn't predict the future or assumed their success would continue indefinitely. And yet, despite all these lost fortunes and fallen dynasties, the early millionaires left behind something more permanent than money. They left institutions, buildings, and ideas that outlasted their wealth and shaped America in ways they probably never imagined. The legacy they left behind. When you walk through almost any major American city, you're surrounded by the legacy of early millionaires. That university, probably funded by a robber baron feeling guilty about his business practices. That library, Carnegie built it, one of 2,500 he paid for. That museum, some Gilded Age millionaire donated the building, the land, or the collection. The parks, hospitals, concert halls, research institutions, they're all monuments to wealth that no longer exists, built by people who are mostly forgotten. Andrew Carnegie's library system is probably the most visible legacy. He built 2,500 libraries across America, spending roughly $56 million in the process. That's roughly $1.5 billion in today's money, spent on buildings where people could read books for free. Carnegie believed that access to knowledge was the key to self-improvement, and libraries were how you provided that access. His libraries had specific architectural requirements. They had to be beautiful, welcoming, centrally located. They needed reading rooms, study spaces, areas for children. Carnegie didn't just throw money at communities and hope for the best. He had standards, requirements, and a genuine vision for what libraries should be. Those libraries still exist. Many have been updated, renovated, or expanded, but the core buildings remain. In small towns across America, the Carnegie Library is often still the nicest public building. A reminder that someone once cared enough about that community to invest in its future. John D. Rockefeller's legacy is different but equally significant. He founded the University of Chicago in 1890, providing the initial funding and continued support that made it one of America's premier research institutions. He established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which pioneered treatments for diseases that had killed thousands. His foundation funded public health campaigns that eradicated hookworm in the American South, where it had been endemic for generations. Rockefeller gave away roughly $550 million during his lifetime, equivalent to about $14 billion today. But more important than the amount was how he gave it. He created foundations designed to outlast him, with professional management and clear missions. The Rockefeller Foundation still exists, still funds research, still works on global health and education. That's a legacy that extends well beyond any individual donation. The railroad barons left physical infrastructure. The rail lines they built, often for profit, occasionally out of genuine civic vision, became the backbone of American transportation for a century. Towns exist because a railroad chose to put a station there. Cities grew because they were railroad hubs. The economic geography of America was largely determined by men like James J. Hill and E.H. Harriman deciding where to lay tracks. Those tracks are still there. Many are still in use, carrying freight, if not passengers. The towns remain, even if some have declined as the importance of rail transport diminished. But the basic structure, which cities matter, how goods move across the country, was established by railroad millionaires in the late 1800s. Wealthy women left equally important legacies, though they're less often recognized. Mary Lyons Mount Holyoke College, founded in 1837, was one of the first institutions of higher education for women in America. It still exists, still educates women, still carries forward Lyons' vision that women deserve the same rigorous education as men. Catherine Wolfe's art collection helped establish the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a major cultural institution. Wealthy women funded hospitals, orphanages, settlement houses that provided services for immigrant communities. They created institutions that addressed social problems male philanthropists often ignored. The Vanderbilt mansions, for all their extravagance, became museums and tourist attractions. The breakers in Newport, Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, these are now places where millions of people learn about Gilded Age history, architecture, and social dynamics. They're educational resources that happen to be absurdly opulent houses. The families spent fortunes building them. Preservationists spent fortunes maintaining them. And now they serve purposes their original owners never imagined. Universities bear the names of early millionaires everywhere. Stanford, Duke, Vanderbilt, Cornell, all founded or substantially funded by wealthy individuals who wanted to create educational institutions. These weren't always purely altruistic gifts. Founding a university got your name on buildings and in history books. But the motivations matter less than the results. Those universities educated millions of people, produced groundbreaking research, and became engines of social mobility. Medical institutions followed similar patterns. Johns Hopkins, a Baltimore merchant and investor, left $7 million to establish both a university and a hospital. Johns Hopkins Hospital revolutionized medical education and patient care. It became a model for modern hospitals, combining research, teaching, and treatment in ways that were innovative for the late 1800s. Hopkins himself died in 1873, but his money continues funding medical advances 150 years later. The philanthropic traditions established by early millionaires shaped American culture in fundamental ways. The idea that wealthy people should give money back to society, that accumulating a fortune creates obligations. These concepts weren't universal before Carnegie and Rockefeller popularized them. Now they're expected. Billionaires who don't engage in philanthropy are criticized for it. That's largely because Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth and actually practiced what he preached. But the legacy isn't entirely positive. The same millionaires who built libraries also created monopolies, exploited workers, and operated in ways that increased wealth inequality. Their philanthropy was often an attempt to rehabilitate reputations damaged by ruthless business practices. Carnegie's libraries don't erase the workers who died in his steel mills. Rockefeller's medical research doesn't cancel out Standard Oil's monopolistic behavior. The physical infrastructure they built sometimes had negative consequences. Railroads displaced Native American communities, enabled westward expansion that destroyed ecosystems, and created economic dependencies that harmed some regions when rail service declined. Real estate development often meant displacing poor communities to build mansions and commercial districts. Still, the institutions remain. The libraries, universities, hospitals, museums, they continue serving purposes their founders intended, and many they didn't. A student using a Carnegie library to study for college exams probably doesn't think about Andrew Carnegie. But they're benefiting from his guilt-motivated philanthropy a century later. That's a legacy. The early millionaires proved that, in America, private wealth could fund public goods. Whether it should have to, Whether we should rely on millionaire philanthropy instead of government funding for libraries and universities is a legitimate question. But in the 18 and 1900s, when government social programs barely existed, philanthropic millionaires filled gaps that would otherwise have remained empty. And ultimately, their most lasting legacy might be the stories themselves. The narrative that anyone in America can build a fortune, that wealth creates responsibility, that success comes from hard work and smart decisions. These ideas permeate American culture partly because of early millionaires' examples. Whether those narratives are accurate, helpful, or fair is debatable, but they're deeply embedded in how Americans think about money, success, and opportunity. Reflections on wealth and a human nature. As we near the end of this journey through early American fortunes, it's worth pausing to consider what these stories tell us about money, people, and the strange relationship between the two. Because beyond the mansions and monopolies and inheritance battles, these millionaires were humans dealing with very human problems, just with more zeros in their bank accounts. Money, it turns out, doesn't solve the fundamental challenges of being alive. Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the richest people in the world and still worried about being respected, still fought with rivals, still dealt with family dysfunction. Andrew Carnegie gave away almost his entire fortune and still wondered if he'd done enough, if his legacy would be positive, if building libraries made up for dangerous working conditions in his mills. The early millionaires were ambitious, certainly. You don't build a shipping empire or corner the oil market without extraordinary drive. But they were also insecure, competitive, sometimes petty. John D. Rockefeller gave dimes to children while crushing competitors who couldn't match his efficiency. Hetty Green was worth over $100 million, but ate cold oatmeal to save heating costs. These aren't the behaviors of perfectly rational economic actors. They're the behaviors of complicated people trying to make sense of wealth that exceeded anything their childhoods prepared them for. The scandals and feuds reveal how money amplifies personality. If you're competitive, wealth lets you compete on a massive scale. If you're generous, you can fund entire universities. If you're petty, you can build a bigger mansion than your rival just to prove a point. Money doesn't create these traits. It just gives them more room to operate. What's striking is how many of these millionaires seemed unhappy despite their success. They worked constantly, worried about competitors, dealt with family conflicts over inheritance, and faced criticism from a public that both admired and resented their wealth. Stephen Girard was phenomenally successful and almost universally disliked. William Randolph Hearst built a media empire and lived in a castle, but his personal life was messy and his later years lonely. Success and satisfaction turned out to be different things. The women who inherited or earned wealth faced different challenges. They had to navigate social expectations that said they shouldn't control money while simultaneously managing estates worth millions. They dealt with male relatives trying to take control of their finances, society questioning their competence, and legal systems that didn't always recognize their rights. Yet many succeeded through intelligence, determination, and occasionally sheer stubbornness in maintaining and growing their wealth. The downfalls are perhaps most instructive. Fortunes that seemed permanent vanished within decades. The lesson isn't just about financial planning, it's about the fragility of human constructions. We build empires thinking they'll last forever. They don't. Industries change, markets crash, children mismanage inheritances, and suddenly the fortune is gone. What remains are the institutions, the buildings, the physical infrastructure that outlasts the money that created it. There's something almost comforting about that impermanence. The robber barons seemed invincible in their time, crushing competitors, influencing politics, living in absurd luxury. But their descendants ended up normal. Their mansions became museums, and their businesses either adapted or disappeared. Wealth didn't make them immortal or immune to human problems. The philanthropy creates its own complicated legacy. On one hand, Carnegie libraries genuinely helped communities. On the other hand, maybe workers would have preferred safer mills and higher wages over libraries built with profits from their labor. Rockefeller's medical research saved lives, but Standard Oil's monopoly limited economic opportunity for others. The charitable giving doesn't erase the ruthless business practices, but it does complicate the moral calculus. What we're left with is ambiguity. These weren't heroes or villains. They were people operating in a specific economic and social context, making choices that seemed reasonable to them, building fortunes through combinations of talent, luck, ruthlessness, and timing. They created institutions we still use, established philanthropic traditions we still follow, and demonstrated possibilities, both positive and negative, of concentrated wealth. The American dream narrative says anyone can become rich through hard work. These millionaires' stories support that narrative. Many started with nothing and built empires, but they also complicate it. Success required not just hard work, but also timing, connections, willingness to operate in morally gray areas, and often simple luck. For every Rockefeller who built $1 billion empire, thousands of other hardworking people died in poverty. Perhaps the real lesson is about proportion and perspective. Money matters. It determines access to education, healthcare, security, opportunities. But beyond a certain point, more money doesn't seem to create more happiness. The millionaires kept accumulating wealth long after they had enough for any reasonable need, driven by competition, insecurity, or the simple fact that they didn't know how to stop. And now, as we drift toward sleep with these stories lingering in our minds, we can appreciate the strangeness of it all. The fact that someone could start with 7 flutes and $25 and die worth millions. That families could fight for decades over inheritance. That libraries built by guilty industrialists still serve communities today. History is messy, contradictory, and deeply human. So, there they are, America's first millionaires in all their complicated glory. The merchant princes who financed revolutions and died in debtor's prison. The industrial titans who built empires and fought each other like children. The quiet developers who shaped cities. The eccentric women who managed fortunes despite society telling them they shouldn't. The gold rush opportunists who got rich selling pants. The railroad barons who connected a continent. They made money in ways that would be illegal today. They exploited workers, crushed competitors, created monopolies, and operated with a ruthlessness that we now regulate against. But they also built universities, funded hospitals, established libraries, and created institutions that continue serving public purposes long after their fortunes vanished. Their personal lives were messy. Feuds, scandals, inheritance battles, divorces, family dysfunction. Having millions of dollars didn't exempt them from human problems. It just meant those problems played out in mansions instead of modest homes and got written about in newspapers for everyone to read. Most of their fortunes didn't last. The Vanderbilts went from 100 million to basically nothing in 3 generations. The willing millionaires lost everything when petroleum arrived. Market crashes, bad investments, and incompetent heirs destroyed dynasties that seemed permanent. But the buildings remain. The infrastructure endures. The institutions they funded continue their work. What we're left with is a complicated picture of American capitalism in its earliest, wildest form. An economy with few rules, where fortunes could be made or lost overnight, where a German immigrant with 7 flutes could become the richest person in America, where a washerwoman's daughter could build a cosmetics empire. Opportunity existed, but so did exploitation, inequality, and suffering. The early millionaires shaped the country we live in today. The cities they developed, the universities they founded, the philanthropic traditions they established. These things persist even as the individuals who created them fade into history. We remember Carnegie and Rockefeller, but we've forgotten dozens of others who were equally wealthy and influential in their time. And maybe that's fitting. Wealth is temporary. Fortunes rise and fall. What endures are the physical structures, the institutions, and the stories. The narrative that in America anything is possible, that hard work and intelligence can overcome poverty, that great success comes with great responsibility. Whether those narratives are completely true doesn't matter as much as the fact that we still believe them, still tell them, still build our society partly on the foundation those early millionaires created. So, as you drift off to sleep, think about those library buildings in small towns across America, the universities educating students who've never heard of their founders, the hospitals treating patients with techniques pioneered by research, funded by long dead millionaires, the railroad towns that exist because someone decided to build a station there in 1880. History isn't just dates and names, it's humans making choices, building things, competing and cooperating, succeeding and failing. The first American millionaires were all of those things: ambitious and petty, generous and ruthless, visionary and short sighted. They were complicated people living in complicated times, and their legacies are just as complicated. The mansions became museums, the monopolies were broken up, the fortunes mostly disappeared, but the libraries remain, the universities continue, the stories persist, and somewhere in all that complexity, there's probably a lesson about what wealth means, what it can do, and what it can't. But you'll have to figure that out for yourself. For now, rest easy knowing that even the richest people in history had to deal with difficult relatives, business rivals, and the universal human experience of not quite knowing what they were doing. Money changes the scale, but it doesn't change the fundamental strangeness of being alive. Sweet dreams.